listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, Victoria's former Premier Dan Andrews is under fire for attending a major military parade in China and posing for photos with the President Xi Jin Ping and also Russian leader Vladimir Putin. The move has been slammed by some of his former Labor colleagues and the opposition. But exactly what is behind the former Premier's bizarre move, and will the government now be asking questions? But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 3rd of September. Victoria Police say they've searched more than 100 properties in Porepunkah and surrounding towns as the search continues for alleged gunman Desi Freeman. It's now 9 days since it's alleged Freeman shot dead 2 police officers and also injured a third after authorities executed a warrant. Victoria Police Commissioner Mike Bush says they have built a good picture of locations frequented by his associates and friends.
I'm not going to talk to any direct intelligence that we might have, but as far as an investigation goes, our elite investigation team consider every possibility and we deploy to that.
More than 33,000 pages of documents and several videos linked to Jeffrey Epstein have been released by the US House Oversight Committee. The documents represent only 1% of the so-called Epstein files. The release follows calls for greater transparency around Epstein's connections, but lawmakers, including the committee chair, have admitted that almost all of the material was already publicly available. While the impact of this latest release remains unclear, the controversy is expected to stay in the spotlight, with several of Epstein's victims set to hold a news conference alongside lawmakers. And Australia's economy has recorded strong growth, with the GDP increasing 0.6% for the June quarter. The stronger than expected results were largely driven by increased consumer spending. Some experts say the latest economic data may lessen the chance of another interest rate cut when the RBA meets later this month. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on Dan Andrews' controversial appearance at a major military parade in China. President Xi Jin Ping walked along the red carpet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin. In a surprise turn of events, the former Victoria Premier Dan Andrews also attended the so-called Victory Day event, shaking hands with the Chinese leader and then posing for photos. Joining us to unpack today's developments is Professor James Laurenceson, Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. James, thanks so much for joining us. Quite extraordinary scenes we've seen this morning, our time, with this show of force, military force, by the Chinese President Xi Jin Ping, along with a number of other world leaders. And in the middle of this photo is the former Victorian Premier Dan Andrews. It's kind of sent shockwaves around the world. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, it's certainly unusual, isn't it? I mean, simply a military parade. That's something that Australians are not particularly used to seeing, and it's pretty rare in the West broadly. Although we shouldn't forget, just a few months ago, President Donald Trump had his own military parade in Washington, but that is unusual. And then, of course, you've got that added dimension of 2 former Australian premiers who are on the ground at the parade. That adds to the intrigue as well. Look, my own view is I think some of the commentary around Bob Carr and Dan Andrews attending is a bit overwrought, but it's certainly unusual.
So in regards to first question many people are asking is, why was Dan Andrews there? And also, he was seen shaking the Chinese president's hand. And right now we understand the very, very shaky diplomatic world we're living in. Also in that photo was the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and also the Russian President Vladimir Putin. How do you think Mr. Albanese would react to this?
Well, we shouldn't forget Prime Minister Albanese just a couple of months ago had his own 6-day extended tour of China, and he was very keen to shake the Chinese president's hand and have an informal lunch with him. Now, of course, Dan Andrews is not the Prime Minister, but I think that does make the point that China is not Australia's enemy. We've got to be clear on that. Australia and China have many differences, and we have had for more than 50 years since Canberra and Beijing established diplomatic relations. But there's also plenty that Australia and China have in common, most notably in the economic and trade space. So simply an Australian going to China and shaking hands with the Chinese president, that doesn't trouble me. But you're right. I mean, in terms of why did Dan Andrews get the invitation? Why did Bob Carr get an invitation? Look, I haven't spoken to them personally, but it's widely known that both of those former premiers have a very positive enough view of Australia-China relations. So I think that's why Beijing would have felt confident extending them an invitation.
The commentary today has certainly been, as you said previously, has been mixed, but we have seen criticisms from both Mr Andrews' former Labor colleagues and also criticism from the opposition, including Angus Taylor. But Anastasia Palaszczuk, paraphrasing the former Queensland Premier here, has basically said, look, go along for trade talks. That's a completely different scenario. You don't go along to a military parade where China is clearly showing the rest of the world here is our military might, and that she would not have done something that Mr Andrews has done. Do you agree with her criticism?
Look, my position is I think every former Australian premier can make their own calculation. I certainly respect Anastasia Palaszczuk's position, but it doesn't particularly trouble me that Bob Carr and Dan Andrews have gone. I mean, we've got to be clear, right? This is not a military parade to celebrate the founding of the Chinese Communist Party or to celebrate China's National Day, right? This is a military parade to mark the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And I do think it is not particularly well known in Australia that Australia and China were actually on the same side of that fight. So I think that's what, if you ask that question to Dan Andrews and Bob Carr, I'm pretty sure that's what they would tell you. We also shouldn't forget, just 10 years ago, under the Abbott coalition government, that government actually sent an Australian government minister to the 70th anniversary event. So that's also a bit of context that I think is missing from the attendance of Andrews and Bob Carr.
James, in regards to that, we've seen the Prime Minister has refused to weigh into this controversy surrounding Mr Andrews today. If it was such a momentous occasion, as you said, to mark the end of World War II, can I ask a question why an Australian diplomat was not sent to that official function? And secondly, why was the US President Donald Trump not attending that? Because as we know, it was momentous for America as well as our rest of the allies for the end of World War II.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, that's the question I think we should be putting to the government rather than, obsessing about Bob Carr and Dan Andrews showing up. We should be clear that there is some Australian government diplomatic representation. My understanding is that the Defence Attaché in the Australian Embassy in Beijing did attend the event. As to why Donald Trump is not there, I would be shocked if Beijing did not, in fact, extend him an invitation. I'm assuming that Beijing would have also extended our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, an invitation. So I'm quite confident the reason Donald Trump is not there is because he declined the invitation. But just because he declined it, we shouldn't fool ourselves. There are plenty of other world leaders on the ground in Beijing today, and I don't just mean Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. The Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, they say we have no more important partner than Indonesia. Well, I can tell you the Indonesian President is on the ground in Beijing today. So is the Malaysian Prime Minister. So is the Vietnamese President. Now, they all have their own issues with China, some of them far more complicated than ours, and yet they've seen fit to send their leader. So again, I don't think we should obsess with the fact or be overly troubled by the fact that we've got two former state politicians showing up in Beijing today.
So if that's a scenario, James, why would former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr pull out of attending that military parade? Do you think he saw the concerns with that?
Look, I haven't spoken to Bob Carr, so I couldn't read his mind. But certainly the commentary over the last few days has been quite ferocious, most of it critical. I note that Bob Carr has actually tried to respond to some of it, but it seems in the end he did make that decision not to attend the military parade. So I'm assuming that's in response to the public criticism that he was receiving.
In regards to the dispute that it was a military parade, during this display, China's military firepower was on full display. Among the weapons used, do you think this was a really, really clear message by the Chinese president about, okay, this is the power we've got if We are in difficult times right now where there are genuine concerns about a shift of the power balance in our world.
Yeah, I think overwhelmingly, you're right. So it was to signal for sure that China in 2025 is a very militarily powerful country that will not be walked over again. But again, let's not forget what this occasion is marking. Right, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Now, in Australia, we lost 20,000 servicemen and women in that fight, right? China lost 20 million people in that fight. So we shouldn't be surprised that not just in the Chinese Communist Party, but in the Chinese population more broadly, that they do have a visceral memory of this event, and they are very keen to make clear to anyone else who might be thinking of, invading China, that they will not be successful in doing that. Now, that's not, of course, when we look at this in Australia, it looks very threatening to us, but China's not doing this, I don't think, to send a threatening message to Australia. They're doing this to send a message to the domestic population that they won't be walked over again. And, you can understand why the Chinese government would want to send that signal domestically.
Absolutely. James, in regards to the US President Donald Trump, we know he didn't attend the military parade. We're not sure if he got invited or not, but he did go to social media, as often the US president does, to Truth Social. And he said that may President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day of celebration, adding, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un," and I'm quoting Mr. Trump here, President Trump, "as you conspire against the United States of America." Thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts, as it is with most of the Trump presidency, is that I think, first and foremost, President Trump is a reality TV show host. And so he knows that those sorts of words will certainly get him a headline. But look, let's be clear. The truth is, just last month, President Trump invited Vladimir Putin to a meeting on US territory. And he talked it up. He made sure it was on the front pages of all the US newspapers and on the first news story in every US TV bulletin. So, let's not get too precious about Trump's social media activity today, when what he did last month was a far deeper engagement than Bob Carr or Dan Andrews will be having with Vladimir Putin today.
So your bottom line is it's a storm in a teacup.
I understand the newsworthiness of it, but when I look around the region and I look at Australia's neighbours, big important neighbours, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, their leaders are there. And what we're talking about is two former state politicians showing up. So I wouldn't quite call it a storm in a teacup, but I think there's been some overwrought commentary.
So in regards to what we mentioned before about the representation, and we understand there are some diplomats attending from the Australian government, do you think this may have just been, I'm just putting it out there, an innocent mistake by the former Victorian Premier, not realising jumping in this photo would be seen very, very differently to what it was initially?
Look, I really can't speculate whether I would hope that a former state premier who was at the helm for a long time, I would hope that he would be quite aware of these international dimensions. So I find it hard to believe that it was simply an innocent mistake. But look, he's not the premier anymore, and my understanding is he now has business interests, and goodness knows, probably some of those involve China. So, now that he's moved on from his government service, if he's in a private capacity and sees getting a photo shaking the Chinese president's hands, that's probably not a bad thing for his business interests.
We'll see how this all plays out. It'll be very interesting to be a fly on the wall as questions are asked. James, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That was Professor James Laurenceson, the Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.